Even the kindest individual can be judgmental, and our tastes vary widely, as do our beliefs. But I have to confess that if Mr. Rogers had ever come to a church where I had been preaching, and he pronounced that he had heard the worst sermon he ever could have imagined, I would have been devastated, my robust ego and thick skin notwithstanding. Mr. Rogers, how could you? And yet I've loved this story since I first read it, partly because I wasn't the preacher that day. I can testify to that. I was not in New England when Fred Rogers was in seminary. But I've loved the story because it reflects on how honest Mr. Rogers was, with adults and with children alike. He admitted to his shortcomings, even to his youngest viewers, and he acknowledged that he was not a perfect man, just an everyday, good, kindly, thoughtful soul, which is as much as any of us can expect. I think most people today would think that Mr. Rogers is among the saints of the world, if saints exist. And yet he too had his moments. I have no doubt that theological school Fred, as he was sitting in that congregation, probably did hear a poorly constructed sermon, and he may have even objected to some of the doctrine. I don't know. But the point that he admits to is that he had arrived with his judgment already in his heart. He didn't hear that morning's sermon with the open heart that he believed we should have when listening to others and their stories. And that woman sitting behind him saved him from his cold heart that morning by responding authentically, genuinely to the words of the preacher, which touched her somewhere deep inside, somewhere that the preacher couldn't reach with Fred Rogers. And that's when he realized that what was most negative about the sermon was what he had brought to it, not what the preacher had done. And he realized that different ones among us need to hear different words at the same moment. And that's an impossible task for any preacher. So I love Fred Rogers' candor. I love how he changed his mind. I love how in an instant, seeing that woman's tears and listening to what he had to say, his heart melted and became open to her feelings. It's a lesson for all of us, I think. When my brother Chuck was young, during those years when many young men seem to spend a lot of time sleeping during the daytime, or at least sleeping late in the morning, our dad used to chastise him. "Nobody's gonna pay you to sleep," he'd say, urging him to get up and do something, perhaps find gainful employment. When Chuck successfully landed a position in the Winnipeg Fire Service, he thought he had the last laugh. After all, firefighting is one of those jobs where you do get paid to sleep. Although you have to be ready to awaken at the speed of a racing car, springing out of bed in seconds and becoming alert enough to handle an emergency. That's not how I wake up in the morning. So I don't begrudge firefighters their nap time when they're not needed to fight a fire or rescue a stranded kitten. Interestingly enough, my dad had a similar but individualized admonition for me too. Nobody's gonna pay you to talk, you know. Well, it turns out that he was every bit as wrong in my case too. He was a very wise man, but he got Chuck and me wrong in terms of what people would pay us to do. Now, I'm not saying that people necessarily feel good about what they spent in the aftermath, but the last laugh was on us. Talking is central to my vocation as a minister. Indeed, talking is central to the idea of vocation and its relationship to voice. Just as it is to broadcasters and counselors, teachers and salespeople. Looking back, I realized that Dad was encouraging me to develop a few useful skills worth talking about, beyond just blathering to people, as well as cautioning me to devote more attention to listening, and not to the sound of my own voice, but listening to others, scanning the landscape for wisdom. It may be that Dad had also read my first grade report card. In fact, I know he did because he signed it. I've still got it in my files somewhere. I took the whole permanent record thing seriously as a youngster, but I couldn't put my fingers on it this week, much to my disappointment. So I have to rely on recollection rather than the ability to quote word for word. I vividly remember that Mrs. McDonald had written on my report, what Mrs. McDonald had written on my report card, beginning with her observation, Stefan reads with feeling. Something I received as a compliment, and that indeed is what it was intended to be, I'm sure. I read with feeling. I didn't think I read all that well, but Mrs. McDonald said, I read with feeling. Looking back on her words some years later, they made a deeper impression on me than they had the day I carried my report card home, which is perhaps why I can quote them without having the document right in front of me. I remembered myself as shy, my reading as halting, and while I enjoyed school, I didn't feel like I was anything more than mediocre as a pupil. But it was nice to know that my teacher saw something in me that I had missed as a 6-year-old. I read with feeling, and years later I felt like a celebrated actor on Broadway to reread those words. Then came the rub. Mrs. McDonald added that I would develop even more fully at school if I learned how to talk less and listen more. I wasn't exactly unruly like many of my classmates, but I was a touch verbose. This may surprise you, but it's true. I recall that Dad replied to this comment by saying that he and Mom were aware of my loquaciousness, including a tendency to interrupt, and that they were working on it. I was their project, and happy to be so. But he also cut me some slack, noting that I was the youngest person by far in the household, under the mistaken impression that I was everyone else's peer, and that I had to be forceful in order to be heard above my siblings. That, in fact, is exactly as I remember it. But the first grade was my earliest indication that good listening skills were important to succeed, and that sometimes I just needed to listen before expressing myself. There weren't a lot of other kids in the neighborhood where I grew up. coming towards the end of the baby boom, although it had once been overrun by them. By the time I was in school, the once overcrowded classrooms had begun to decline in numbers and empty out. Curiously enough, the only place in my life that was overcrowded with children was the Lutheran Sunday school I attended sporadically for a couple of years, in a church that later amalgamated with a neighboring Anglican congregation, only to continue dwindling in numbers until it closed altogether a few years ago. But it was crowded, as I remember it. Mostly, though, I spent my childhood surrounded by adults. And while my teachers might not have believed it, I actually spent a lot of time listening, just listening. And I listened carefully. I was fascinated by my elders' reminiscences and the stories they wove, sometimes rather pedestrian, and other times almost brilliant, even magical. I loved to eavesdrop on my elders' conversations, which by necessity required listening without intruding upon them. Had I done so, they might have lowered their voices to a whisper, or those who could might have spoken Icelandic or in French. So I listened carefully and quietly. I was a snoop. I was interested in knowing all the things that perhaps I wasn't supposed to know and tucking it away somewhere in the deep recesses of my brain to use sometime later. So it was that most of the stories I have to tell today are not my own experiences, but the stories of others that I was fortunate enough to overhear, reflect upon, and then incorporate into my own lifelong narrative. I learned more eavesdropping on conversations than I believe I learned from my textbooks and classes. It was wonderful. Although we often admonish children to listen, it is actually adults who seem to betray listening deficits. Not hearing deficits, listening deficits. There's a difference. Most of us hear just fine, or at least well enough, but it's listening to others that poses the greater problem. We can absorb a steady stream of words without listening to a single one of them. This is a standing joke in comics and situation comedies about couples not listening to one another. Now, I know that none of you are like that, but we've seen it in others. And it's only funny because it's true. In the midst of it, it can be infuriating, though. Now, we cherish free speech and free expression, but at the same time, we often neglect the obligation to listen, without which our freedom to speak is meaningless. Free speech doesn't work if there aren't people freely and determinedly listening. In our capacity to tune out the words of others, it has only increased as modern technology allows us to magnify our words in ways that past generations couldn't have imagined. Our technology encourages passive listening, where words are often little more than background noise, and we have increasingly lost much of our capacity to listen actively, to absorb and reflect upon the cacophony of spoken words that surround us. I can listen to the radio or the television all night while I'm sleeping, and I suspect that many of you can too. With the increase in electronic technology, with broadcasting and other sources of amusement, increasingly what we hear, the words we listen to, become background noise rather than real communication. At times, we may as well just be on an elevator listening to the music. Now, in fairness, not everything we hear requires deep listening. A lot of our everyday conversation is of the kind that we can hear, act on it quickly, and move on. Much of it is chatter. Small talk is legendary, and while I'm actually not very good at it, it's one of the most common forms of expression between individuals. Small talk and chatter, once again, encourage us to disconnect. But what about those times when we really, really need to listen to one another? Sometimes we think our level of listening is just fine until there is a social explosion happening around us, where someone who has been speaking to us without our hearing a real word that they have said, without our hearing the meaning behind their words, finally has had enough and they demand our attention. It can be a spouse or a partner. It can be a good friend, an old companion. It can be one of our children. They're exceptionally good at demanding attention when the time is when it's necessary to do so. And so there's a deeper listening that we are sometimes called to, especially in the most meaningful of our conversations. Active listening requires skill, discipline, and practice. And only then are we usually in a position to open our hearts and listen deeply. There's nothing passive about active listening. I've heard it said, or more precisely, I've seen it written, that we speak at about 150 words per minute. Some assert that our listening capacity is only about 400 to 500 words per minute. Some go a step further and suggest it may be as high as 1,000 words per minute, but I'm not really convinced, since I can't even speed read at that rate. The gap between how fast someone speaks and our capacity to listen creates space for our minds to wander. Perhaps out the window, towards the beautiful riverbank, through the trees, across to the apartments on the other side of the river. A friend of mine calls this going fishing. I've seen estimates that say we only listen at about a quarter of our capacity, and that 3/4 of what we hear is lost even as we listen. Although I've always been a little skeptical of measuring the immeasurable. And in this case, it seems to be an overly generous estimate in the first place, and probably of short duration. I have a hard time relaying the details of a phone message if I don't take notes when listening to it, beginning with jotting down the name of the caller. When our minds have an opportunity to wander, we can be pretty sure they will, unless we discipline ourselves to focus on what we're hearing and channel our idle capacity to process what we hear more fully, rather than wander in the direction of what we'd rather be doing or what we plan to say in response to what we're hearing. That's my favorite. Especially when I'm talking to the television, where they have so many foolish commentators that are allowed to say some of the most ridiculous things, and I have the answer to what they've said before they even finish. And so sometimes I shout it back at the screen. We may think about a piece of unfinished business while our mind wanders, or impute meaning to something someone is saying where no meaning, or not the meaning we impute, really exists. Active listening is the active search for meaning. The receiver reserves judgment, weighs the words, and places themselves in the speaker's position, according to a management brief I once read and clipped. The goal is to receive as much of the original meaning as possible. But we can develop our listening skills. Many years ago, I received a handout that identified several keys to active listening, a few of which I will paraphrase and offer for your reflection. First of all, good listeners identify a reason or a purpose for listening in the first place, which allows them to remain interested in what is being said, while they mine what they are hearing for its value and its meaning. Next, we need to suspend our judgment on what is being said, at least for the moment, so that we can concentrate on what the speaker is actually saying rather than leaping to conclusions about what they are trying to say, even before the words have escaped their mouths. Formulating our own witty response or rebuttal while another is still speaking only gets in the way of listening. In addition to suspending our judgment, it's important to minimize and overcome distractions in order to focus on what is being said. Background noise, outside activities, scanning the landscape, including the landscape we call smartphones, and giving attention to other people can undermine our ability to listen to others. Finally, when it is time to respond to what we've heard, it's fair to pause before saying anything at all while we absorb what we've heard. Of course, we will occasionally encounter someone with whom we dare not pause, or we won't be able to begin. But for the most part, people will give us time to take a breath and remain silent, if only for a moment. And when what we've heard is unclear or laden with emotion, we may wish to restate what we've heard in our own words, which shows at least that we were listening, while allowing the other person to confirm that we heard what they meant, whether or not we agree with them. And it helps to watch for visual clues too, since much of what we communicate is never spoken with words at all, but rather shown through our posture and our gestures and our other actions. It was his seatmate's tears that Fred Rogers first noticed after he sat in judgment about a sermon he didn't care to hear. It was her tears that motivated him to remain silent when she told him that the preacher that morning had said exactly what she needed to hear. And it was only then that he suspended judgment about the sermon and understood that something very important had happened, and that a poorly crafted sermon can be translated into a message that spoke to her heart. And that, in turn, proved to be one of the greatest lessons of his life. When we open our hearts to listen, to truly listen, then we open ourselves to receive whatever message, whatever lesson the universe may be trying to tell us, whether or not we wish to hear it. More importantly, open heart listening is a more valuable way to demonstrate our regard for others than anything we might ever say. Indeed, many of us carry within ourselves the fear that at the critical moment, we won't have the right words to say, not realizing that at such moments, it's often our capacity to listen and to sit in silence with someone we love that matters more. I hear you is not a facile phrase. It's a term of endearment. Love and trust in the space between what's said and what's heard in our life can make all the difference in this world, according to Fred Rogers. The gifts we treasure most over the years are often small and simple. In easy times and in tough times, what seems to matter most is the way we show those nearest us that we've been listening to their needs, to their joys, and to their challenges. Please join in the closing hymn, number 300, With Heart and Mind.